Chapter 4. Cooking Up Trouble. Typhoid in New York, 1906. "Oh, Cook, I just had to come and talk to you about this evening's dinner." Mrs. Warren was rarely seen in the kitchen of the family's grand rented summer house at Oyster Bay, Long Island, and when she did appear, the cook noticed that it always caused a commotion among the staff. Not surprising, really. Mary had worked for many wealthy families over the years, and in her experience the lady of the house generally came to the kitchen only to complain. She'd been cooking for the Warren family in this fashionable summer resort town for almost 3 weeks now, so she was probably overdue for a scolding. The clams she'd served tonight, had they smelled a little off? Rich New York City folks could be terribly sensitive, she knew that. Mary hoped she wasn't going to be fired. It had been hard enough to finding this job, and she didn't look forward to the thought of pounding the pavement to look for work again so soon. But to her relief, she realized Mrs. Warren had come to the kitchen to praise her. The clams were so tender, sublime, and the dessert so refreshing, just the thing for a warm summer evening. My daughters were in heaven. What do you call that dessert? It's peach melba, ma'am. Very fashionable just now. All the best New York restaurants are serving it, they say. Peach Melba, how wonderful! You must make it for us again. I'm very pleased with you, cook, and I intend to keep you on in the fall. I imagine that suits you. Yes, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Fine. Good evening, Mary. A shameful disease. The Warrens' cook, Mary Mallon, went to bed that night, glad to have a steady job for the fall. She would happily please her employers with more special desserts, a peach pie perhaps, but there would be no more elaborate meals cooked for the Warren family that summer. A few days later, on August 27th, 1906, the household awoke to turmoil. Margaret, one of the Warrens' daughters, was seriously ill. Margaret had gone to bed early, complaining of a bad headache. By morning it was worse, and soon she was doubled over with stomach cramps. As the day wore on, Margaret developed a violent cough, and her mother noticed that the girl's skin was hot and dry, almost burning to the touch. That afternoon, one of the maids collapsed and had to be sent to bed. Then the gardener drooped over his rake, and he too had to be helped into bed. By the evening, the Warrens' second daughter had joined her sister in the sick room. Finally, Mrs. Warren herself was stricken. More than half of the members of the household were now fighting for their lives. Doctors were called in, first from the nearby town, then specialists from New York City. Private nurses in white uniforms whisked down the corridors, carrying cups of broth on silver trays. There were grave faces and whispered conferences between the medical men. Finally, the diagnosis was delivered. Typhoid fever. Typhoid! It was unthinkable. Wealthy New York bankers' wives and daughters were not supposed to get typhoid. Not in 1906. Not in fashionable resort towns like Oyster Bay, Long Island. Typhoid was a disease of the poor. It meant that you didn't have proper standards of hygiene in your home. Immigrants, laborers, servants, those were the people who fell ill with typhoid, not the rich and privileged. Outraged, Charles Warren demanded an explanation from the owner of the summer house, George Thompson. Thompson was worried. If he couldn't find the source of the disease, his luxury summer house might get a bad reputation, and then how would he rent it out next year? If people in New York heard that typhoid was running rampant in Oyster Bay, it could hurt the whole town. And he had 4 other houses to rent each summer. This mystery needed to be cleared up, quickly and discreetly. Thompson started asking around for an investigator with a scientific or medical background. A few weeks later, Thompson found just the man for the job, George Soper. George designed and managed sewer systems for a living, so he knew a lot about how disease could be spread through water contaminated by human waste. He had made a name for himself as an investigator by tracking down the source of a typhoid epidemic in Ithaca, New York, a few years earlier. Now he packed his bags for Oyster Bay. The first thing George did was check the house's plumbing. He put colored dye in the Warrens' toilet and flushed it to see if it would show up in the home's drinking water. The water from the taps remained clear and colorless. Next, he looked for leaks in the home's cesspool where the waste was collected. It was fine. Contaminated milk was a frequent source of typhoid, but the dairy that supplied the Warren family was spotlessly clean. One by one, George eliminated the usual suspects for a typhoid outbreak. Finding the source wasn't going to be easy as he had hoped. George interviewed all the family members, trying to sniff out something unusual that might have happened in the days leading up to the outbreak. Someone recalled that they'd all eaten clams bought from a local woman on the beach. George checked, but none of the clam seller's other customers had gotten sick. It wasn't a case of contaminated shellfish. Still, it made George wonder if something the family had eaten might have picked up contamination in the kitchen. He went to talk to the kitchen staff and heard something that made his ears perk up. The family's cook, hired just 3 weeks before everyone got sick, had recently quit. He asked more about the cook, an Irish woman whose specialty was a dessert of peaches and ice cream called peach melba. Listening to the family sing the cook's praises, George realized that she could have passed microbes to them when she handled the uncooked fruit. New cook hired, family gets ill. New cook leaves suddenly without any explanation. It was highly suspicious behavior, in George's opinion. He asked for the cook's name. It's Mary Mallon. Tracking the suspect. George headed straight back to New York City, where he stopped in an employment agency that supplied the city's wealthiest households with servants. Did they have the records for a cook by the name of Mary Mallon? Indeed they did. Working backward through their employment history, George visited each of the families Mary Mallon had cooked for. A disturbing pattern emerged. In every household in which he had worked in the last 10 years, there had been an outbreak of typhoid fever. Mind you, there wasn't a single exception, George wrote in his report about the case. George's detective work showed that Mary was linked to 22 cases of typhoid and 1 death, all in homes with no previous history of the disease. But how could Mary have been ill and contagious with typhoid for 10 years? George began to wonder if Mary Mallon was somehow able to pass on the typhoid infection to others without showing any symptoms of the disease herself. In 1906, a few doctors and epidemiologists were beginning to suspect that, in some cases, healthy people could transmit disease. Today they are called asymptomatic carriers. A German bacteriologist, Dr. Robert Koch, had recently published a scientific paper about a healthy carrier of typhoid. The carrier was a woman who had come down with typhoid years before and made a full recovery. When the doctor examined her, he found to his surprise that her feces, urine, and blood were still full of active typhoid bacteria. George Soper knew the only way to be sure if Mary was a healthy carrier was to test her urine and feces to see if they contained the Salmonella typhi bacteria that caused typhoid. But he had to find her first. Months went by with no leads. Then, in the spring of 1907, George happened to hear about a family living on a fashionable Park Avenue in New York City whose daughter was terribly ill with typhoid. He hurried over and soon learned that the family had recently hired a cook. Yes, her name was Mary. Why, yes, Mary Mallon. Did George know her? George probably ran all the way to the kitchen. He'd found the elusive Mary Mallon at last, but the interview he'd looked forward to for so long didn't go well. In his eagerness to make an important scientific discovery, he overlooked the fact that he was dealing with a human being with emotions, not just a walking collection of typhoid germs. When a strange man burst into her kitchen and demanded that she give him samples of her blood, feces, and urine, Mary was insulted and horrified. She did what any self-respecting cook would do. She grabbed the nearest weapon, a sharpened carving fork, and chased the madman out.